What are your stories about spoiled kids meeting the real world? There was this girl in high school who always got away with bad stuff. She was the principal's daughter, so she thought she could do whatever she wanted. She broke things, drank alcohol even though she was too young, and was really mean to other kids. No one ever punished her. When she went to college, she thought she could keep doing the same things. One day, she decided to mess up a big room where classes were held. She wrote on the walls and broke some chairs. But this time, she got caught. The college didn't care who her dad was. They kicked her out right away and told her she could never come back. Her parents were really mad about this. They went on Facebook and complained for months about how unfair it was to their poor baby. The girl tried to get into other colleges, but no one wanted her. Every time she applied, they said no. Her parents kept whining online about how mean everyone was being to their daughter. But really, she was just facing the consequences of her actions for the first time. Story 2. I grew up in a weird situation. My family had a lot of money for a while. We had nannies and drivers, and I got pretty much whatever I wanted. But my parents kept me really sheltered, so I didn't know how to act around other people. I was a spoiled brat, but I didn't even realize it. I was rude and never said please or thank you. It wasn't because I was trying to be mean. I was just too lazy to bother. I had a cousin who didn't have as much money as we did. She didn't like how spoiled I was. One time, we got into a fight because I left her out when I was playing with some other kids. I thought I could fix it by buying her a chocolate milk. I figured that would make her want to be friends again. But my cousin got really mad. She yelled at me in front of everyone. She said I'd never have any real friends if I thought I could just buy people off. I was only 11, but those words really stuck with me. After that, my cousin never wanted to be close to me again, even when I tried to be nicer. Then things got even weirder. I ended up going to a fancy private school. Most of the kids there were way richer than me. Their families had millions of dollars. I wasn't as rich as them, and I wasn't white like most of them. Then my family started having money problems. The other kids at school were really mean to me. They bullied me for not being as rich or white as them. It was like I went from being the spoiled kid to the one getting picked on. Life can be pretty strange sometimes. Story 3. I had this boyfriend once who was always in trouble. He was older than me and kept going in and out of jail for kids, and even real jail. I was only 16 and thought dating a bad boy would be cool. Man, was I wrong about that. This guy was always doing awful things, but no matter what he did, his family would make excuses for him. They'd say stuff like, it's not his fault, his friends are a bad influence, or he's really a good person deep down, he just had a bad day. It was like those crime shows on TV where someone gets murdered. The victim's family wants justice, but the killer's family keeps saying their kid is innocent. They act like the victim's family is being mean by wanting the killer punished. That's exactly how my ex's family was. It didn't matter what he did or how much proof there was. His family was messed up. They always stood by him and made excuses. They even rewarded him sometimes after he did terrible things. I learned the hard way that some families will defend their kids no matter what. They can't see how their child is hurting others. They think everyone else is the problem, not their perfect kid. Looking back, I see how crazy it all was. I thought I was so grown up, dating an older guy with a bad reputation. But really, I was just a kid who got mixed up with the wrong person and his dysfunctional family. It taught me a lot about how not to raise kids and how to spot red flags in relationships. Story 4. When I was 16, I had this friend who was super rich. Like crazy rich. He had so much money, he could have used it as toilet paper and not even cared. One day, he decided he wanted to cook for me and another friend. We had no clue that he'd never cooked anything in his whole life. So, we're in his fancy kitchen, and he grabs an onion to start cooking. I wasn't really paying attention because I was watching videos on my phone. After a few minutes, I hear him groan, "Ugh, why do they have to wrap these so tight?" I look up, and I can't believe what I'm seeing. This guy thought the onion skin was some kind of wrapper. He'd been trying to peel it off like it was plastic or something. He had no idea that onions just grow like that. It was pretty funny, but also kind of sad. This guy had so much money, but he'd never even learned basic stuff about food. He'd probably never even been in a kitchen before that day. You'd think after embarrassing himself like that, he might try to learn some real-life skills. But nope, not this guy. He never had to face any consequences for being so clueless. These days, he's trying to be famous on Instagram. He only has about 800 followers, which isn't really that many, but it doesn't matter to him. He's still got tons of money and doesn't have to work a single day in his life if he doesn't want to. Story 5. There was this girl in college who was used to having everything handed to her. She'd spend about $100 every day just on food and drinks. That's way more than most people spend. One day, her parents got fed up. The girl was drinking too much and skipping classes, so they decided to stop giving her money. Now she had to get a job like regular people. The girl freaked out. She went on Facebook and started whining about how she was going to starve. She begged people to give her money. Some kind folks offered to make her dinner or give her groceries, but that wasn't good enough for her. She said, "No thanks. I just need about $100 to get through the day. I don't like to grocery shop." Can you believe that? She thought she needed $100 every single day just for food. Here's how she was blowing through so much cash. She always ate at restaurants instead of cooking. She'd go to Starbucks twice a day for fancy coffee drinks. Then she'd buy snacks and alcohol on top of all that. This girl had no idea how to live on a budget. She thought it was normal to spend as much on food each day as some people spend in a whole week. Story 6. I had this friend in college whose family was super rich. They had huge, expensive houses in America and Europe. She always looked down on me because I said I'd be happy to go to any medical school that accepted me. I ended up getting into my state's medical school, which was pretty good. But when I told her, she just rolled her eyes. She said, "Oh, I could get into that school easily. My mom knows people in the admissions office. But I'd never apply there because it's not even a good school." She kept bragging about how her mom could get her into a really fancy, top-ranked school too. All through college, she had this annoying attitude. Even though I was getting better grades than her, she'd say stuff like, "It doesn't matter. You'll end up at some random school, and I'll go to my dream school. That's just how the world works for people like me." Well, guess what? A few years later, I looked her up on Facebook to see what happened. Turns out, she didn't end up at her dream school after all. She's actually at her own state's medical school, and get this, it's not even as good as the one she made fun of me for going to. I don't want to say I hoped she wouldn't get into medical school at all. That would be pretty mean. But I have to admit, I felt a little happy seeing her get knocked down a peg. It's like the world was teaching her a lesson about being so full of herself. Story 7. Back in the 1970s, I drove a school bus. It was a time when they were mixing kids from different neighborhoods to make schools more fair. I'd drive poor kids to the rich part of town, then rich kids to the poor part. There were lots of spoiled kids, but one really stood out. This rich kid thought he could do whatever he wanted. He was always breaking rules. One day, I caught him trying to set a bus seat on fire with a lighter. There were too many other kids watching for him to lie his way out of it this time. The school called a big meeting with the kid, his rich dad, and some officials. They decided to ban the kid from riding any school bus for the rest of the semester. I thought his dad would argue, but he didn't. He offered to pay for the damage and accepted the punishment without complaining. But then something really surprising happened. The next morning, I got to work at 6 a.m. to clean my bus like I always did. But the rich kid and his dad were already there waiting for me. The dad introduced his son as my new personal bus cleaner for the rest of the year. Every single morning after that, the dad would bring his son to clean my bus before school. The kid had to wash everything and scrub the floors. It was a real change from how he used to act. As the year went on, something amazing happened. The kid started working hard and even being friendly. We actually started to get along pretty well. Sometimes I'd even help him out so he could finish faster and get to school. By the end of the year, that entitled brat had turned into a pretty decent kid. His dad's clever punishment had taught him a real lesson about responsibility and respect. Story 8. When I was in grad school, there was this really spoiled guy in our program. His mom had bought his way in, paying for everything. He never did any work and always had excuses. This guy made a big mistake. He added me as a friend on Facebook back in 2007. On Facebook, he'd brag about all the fun stuff he was doing instead of schoolwork. Every time he'd skip class or beg for more time on assignments, I'd take a screenshot of his Facebook posts. I saved these for months. Finally, I showed all these screenshots to our program director. The director had been getting fed up with this guy's lies, but didn't have any proof. Now he did. The spoiled guy got kicked out of our program. He didn't graduate, but that wasn't the end of his bad behavior. He did something really awful after that. He got the program director's son drunk and took advantage of him. The son was too drunk to say yes or no. It was so bad that the police got involved. When his mom found out about this, she stopped talking to him. But here's the messed up part. She didn't care that he'd hurt someone. She was only mad because she found out he liked guys. A few years later, a friend of mine from grad school went to buy a used couch. Guess who was working at the furniture store? The spoiled guy. It's really sad that his parents stopped talking to him just for being gay. That's not right at all, but it's hard to feel too bad for him losing all his money and privileges. He was a really awful person who hurt a lot of people. I hope he's learned something from all this, but I'm not sure he has. Some people never change, no matter what happens to them. Story 9. I used to have this best friend who was really spoiled growing up. His family wasn't super rich, but they always gave him whatever he wanted. They never taught him to take responsibility for his actions. After we finished school, he did a bunch of really bad things. First, he lost his driver's license. He ran a red light and said it wasn't his fault because there weren't many cars around. Then he sped through a school zone and said it wasn't his fault because no kids were there. He also got in trouble when his friend wasn't wearing a seatbelt in his car. He quit his job because he wanted to skateboard more. He did this by cheating on his girlfriend instead of going to work, then bragged about it online. Now no one will give him money or hire him because he's so irresponsible. At a family barbecue, he did something really awful to a 14-year-old girl. He was 21 at the time. Somehow he didn't get in trouble for this. One night at a club, he got into a fight with a bouncer. When the police tried to arrest him, he fought them too. He had to spend a week in jail for that. He moved to different cities and even to Germany, but he ended up homeless for a long time. He's still homeless now. There's more too. Once he was skateboarding in a fast food parking lot. When a police officer asked him to leave, he got into a fight with the cop. His family had to use their connections to get him out of trouble. He even tried to sue the police officer afterward. Another time, he took a train without paying. His mom got fined $350 for it. When she gave him money to pay the fine, he just kept it. The fine went up to $960 and he disappeared. On that same train ride, his friends left him behind. He freaked out so badly that he got arrested. This guy never learned from his mistakes. He kept doing bad things and never took responsibility. His parents tried to protect him, but in the end, it just made things worse. Now he's homeless and alone, and it's because he never learned how to be a good person or take care of himself. Story 10. I used to work at a public library where some local celebrities would come in sometimes. Most of them were pretty nice, but there was this one guy who was always grumpy and rude. He'd complain about everything, waiting in line, late fees, you name it. We'd just say stuff like, "Sorry, those are the rules," or "Thanks for being patient," even though he was anything but patient. One day, this guy and I were both having a bad day. When I told him there was a limit on how many DVDs and video games he could take out at once, he got really mad. He slammed his hands on the desk and yelled, "Do you know who I am?" Now keep in mind, this was a grown man throwing a tantrum. I was just a college student who looked like I was barely old enough to drive. I was tired of him always being a bully, so I decided to stand up to him. I looked him right in the eye and said, "Yes, I do know who you are, Mr. X. And guess what? The rules still apply to you. So which of these do you want me to put back?" He was shocked. I don't think anyone had ever told him before that he had to follow the same rules as everyone else. He just stood there with his mouth open, not knowing what to say. After that day, he was a little nicer when he came to the library. Not a lot nicer, but at least he stopped yelling and slamming things. I guess sometimes even famous people need to be reminded that they're not above the rules. Story 11. This is a funny story my dad told me from when he was in college. He had this roommate who was a real jerk. This guy always bragged about how rich his family was and acted like he was smarter and better than everyone else. Now, my dad grew up really poor in Missouri with just his mom in the 1950s and 60s. He wasn't about to let this rich kid push him around. One day, something weird happened. The roommate started taking some medicine that made his pee turn green. He used the bathroom and didn't flush. Gross, right? When my dad saw the green pee in the toilet, he got an idea for a prank. My dad got together with his other roommates, and they cooked up a plan. They decided to trick the annoying roommate. They told him that green pee was a sign of menopause. Now, menopause is something that only happens to women when they get older. But this guy didn't know that. The roommates convinced this guy that he needed to go to the doctor right away. They told him to tell the doctor he thought he was going through menopause. Can you believe it? This guy who always bragged about being so smart actually fell for it. So, off he went to the doctor, all worried about having menopause. When he came back, my dad said the look on his face was priceless. The doctor had told him that men don't go through menopause and that he'd been tricked. After that, the roommate stopped bragging about being smarter than everyone else. I guess he learned that being rich doesn't always mean you're smart. Story 12. I went to a fancy college in the same town where I grew up. This school had lots of rich, spoiled kids. One of my high school buddies joined a fraternity full of these rich guys. My friend was cool, but his frat brothers were awful. During winter break, my friend threw a party at the frat house for all us local kids. It was like a high school reunion. One of his frat brothers, who was still in town, decided to come too. I'd seen this frat guy at parties before, and he was the worst. He'd bother girls, drink way too much, try to start fights, and bully people by saying stuff like, "Do you know who my family is?" Most college students wouldn't hit him because we could get in trouble, but he was about to learn that not everyone cared about his family name. At the party, this guy was acting like a jerk as usual. He threw a drink at one guy and slapped a girl's butt. But he made a big mistake. See, a bunch of my old high school football teammates were there. These were big, tough farm boys who weren't used to taking crap from some preppy rich kid who thought he was better than everyone. Those farm boys got really angry. They weren't worried about getting in trouble with the school or impressed by his family name. They started beating him up pretty bad. I had to pull my old teammates off him before they really hurt him. Story 13. There was this guy in my robotics group who had everything handed to him on a silver platter. His family was super rich because his grandpa got lucky with an oil investment. Then his dad made even more money by buying lots of houses to rent out. This guy thought it would be cool to show off how rich he was during a school trip to Philadelphia. He drove his fancy, tricked-out SUV to a school in a rough part of town. We were there to talk to younger kids about robotics and how fun it is. Our plan was to visit the Franklin Institute Museum from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., then go to a hockey game. But at 9:30 a.m., when we were leaving the school, we saw our bus driver talking to the police. 5 kids had driven themselves to Philly, and guess whose car was missing? Yep, this guy's $90,000 monster truck was gone. After 2 months of searching, all they ever found was his stereo in a pawn shop and his laptop. But here's the craziest part. He didn't even have insurance on the car. He thought he was so rich he could just buy a new car for anyone he might crash into. His dad was furious when he found out. As punishment, he cut the guy's allowance down to $200 a month. That might sound like a lot to some people, but for this kid, it was nothing. His dad also made him drive an old beat-up car until he could save up his own money for a new one. Story 14. My brother had a really tough time in school because he's autistic. There was this one kid who bullied him all the time, and let me tell you, this bully was the most spoiled, entitled kid I've ever met. The bully's dad was always trying to make his son tough. He paid for boxing lessons, karate classes, and other fighting sports. This made the bully think he was the best at anything physical, and he loved to pick on kids who weren't into sports. My brother is more of a bookworm. He'd rather read in the library than play sports, which made him an easy target for bullies. One day, the bully had my brother backed up against a wall. My brother decided he wasn't going to just take it anymore. But here's the thing. My brother doesn't like violence, so he wasn't going to fight back in the usual way. Instead, when the bully tried to punch him, my brother did something really smart. He just ducked. The bully ended up punching the wall instead of my brother. He broke 3 of his fingers and had to go to the hospital. That's when his dad finally found out what had been going on at school. The bully's dad was furious, but not at my brother. He was mad at his own son for being such a jerk. He canceled all the bully's special classes and training. He even sold all of the kids' electronics and games as punishment. The dad also told his son that if he wanted a car when he got older, he'd have to work and save up for every penny himself. No more handouts. Story 15. There was this rich kid in our town who thought he could do whatever he wanted. One night, he parked his big SUV in a no parking zone outside a club. Of course, a tow truck showed up to take the car away. When the rich kid saw what was happening, he went crazy. He started yelling at the tow truck driver, saying stuff like, "Do you know who my dad is?" He thought that because his family had money, the rules didn't apply to him. The kid kept this up for a couple of minutes, getting louder and angrier. But then something unexpected happened. The passenger door of the tow truck opened, and out stepped this big, tough-looking guy. Turns out, this guy was a full member of the Hells Angels motorcycle club. If you don't know, the Hells Angels are a pretty intimidating group that most people don't want to mess with. The biker walked up to the rich kid and very politely, and I'm using air quotes here, told him that it didn't matter who his family was. The car was parked illegally, and it was getting towed. End of story. The rich kid suddenly got very quiet. All his big talk about his important family didn't mean anything to this biker. The tow truck driver hooked up the SUV and drove away, leaving the rich kid standing there, probably feeling pretty embarrassed. Story 16. Back in college, my friend had this roommate who was pretty spoiled. He hung out with us a lot, and sometimes he was okay to be around, but other times he could be a real brat. One day, we overheard him arguing with his mom on the phone about money. We found out that in less than a year, he had spent $30,000 that his parents gave him just for food and fun stuff. Keep in mind, his parents were already paying for his school, his place to live, and his car. This money was just for extra things. He was saying really mean things to his mom and then hung up on her. His dad called next, and they got into a big fight, yelling and cursing at each other. When the call ended, the guy was so mad that he threw his iPhone at the wall and broke it. This was back when iPhones were pretty new and expensive. It turned out his parents had decided to stop giving him money. He couldn't afford to stay in school anymore, so he had to drop out and drive back home to another state. He thought he was too good to get a regular job like most people have to do. About a year later, he added me on Facebook. By this time, he had gotten really into conspiracy theories about 9/11. Even though it was years after it happened and Obama was president. I only ever replied to him once, just to correct one fact he got wrong about 9/11. He went crazy over this. He sent me 4 messages really fast, telling me to open my eyes and believe his theories. Then he blocked me, so I couldn't respond. Story 17. When I was in high school, I got to go to this really fancy American school in Switzerland. My dad's job paid for most of it, which was super lucky for me. Most kids there had parents working for the US government or in Saudi Arabia. There were a few Saudi kids at the school too. One of them, let's call him the prince, was actually in line for the Saudi throne. But he was so far down the list, like 1,455th place, that he'd probably never be king. Still, his family was crazy rich, richer than most of us can even imagine. The school had some strict rules. One was that students couldn't have cars, even if they were old enough to drive in Switzerland. This rule really bugged the prince, but he managed to get through the school year without a car. During summer break after his junior year, the prince drove his Lamborghini from Geneva up to the school. The road to the school is full of sharp turns up a mountain. While trying to make one of these turns, he lost control and flipped his Lamborghini into a vineyard. Oops! His parents were furious about the crash. To punish him, they replaced his wrecked Lamborghini with a Porsche. Yeah, a Porsche. Most people would be thrilled to get a Porsche, right? But not the prince. When school started again, he wouldn't stop complaining about how unfair his punishment was. The rest of us just looked at each other, amazed. We couldn't believe someone would be upset about getting a Porsche as a punishment. It really showed how different his world was from ours. For him, going from a Lamborghini to a Porsche was a big step down. For most of us, either car would be an unbelievable luxury. Story 18. On my college campus, there was only one coffee shop. It was always super crowded, especially in the mornings. Most of us learned pretty quick that if you wanted coffee before class, you had to get there really early and be patient. It was always funny to watch new students try to get coffee right before their first class. They'd show up 5 minutes before class started, see the long line, and leave looking sad when they realized they wouldn't get their coffee in time. One day, this new girl shows up. She's dressed like a typical college freshman, campus t-shirt, jean shorts, and a baseball cap with a blonde ponytail sticking out the back. She sees the long line going out the door and decides she's just going to skip it. Now, the coffee shop workers were usually okay with people skipping the line for quick things like buying a pencil or a cookie. But this girl wanted a whole coffee drink made. She goes right up to the counter while someone else is still paying and says, "Hi, can I get a latte, please?" Like really quickly. The worker looks confused and says, the line starts back there." The girl whines, "But I have class." There's an awkward silence, and then the worker says, "You're on a college campus. Are you serious? Why do you think all these people are here? Go to the back of the line." The girl just says, "Oh," and turns around. But here's the weird part. She doesn't look upset or embarrassed. She looks like she just learned something amazing. It's like for the first time ever, she realized that other people might have good reasons for being in her way. It was actually kind of cool to watch. It was like seeing someone suddenly understand something important about the world. Like a baby deer learning to walk for the first time. I guess it's better to learn that lesson late than never learn it at all. Maybe from that day on, she started to think more about other people and not just herself. Story 19. I went to a really fancy Catholic high school where most of the kids were white and came from rich families. One day, something happened that really opened my eyes to how different our world was from most people's. Our school was always winning competitions in skiing, golf, and horseback riding, but we never did well in other sports. One of the girls at school was bragging about how good our school was at these particular sports. I decided to explain to her why we always won those competitions. I told her, most kids don't grow up with their own horses, or go skiing every winter, or play golf regularly. The look on her face was priceless. It was like her whole world just flipped upside down. She had no idea that having a horse wasn't normal for most girls. For a lot of kids at our school, this was the moment they realized they were rich. They suddenly understood that their normal wasn't everyone else's normal. Things they took for granted, like skiing trips, golf lessons, or horseback riding, were actually really expensive hobbies that most families can't afford. It was kind of funny and sad at the same time. These kids had lived in such a bubble that they didn't even know they were privileged. They thought everyone lived like they did. Story 20. One cool thing about being in the military is that when everyone's in uniform, you can't tell who grew up rich or poor. It's like starting fresh, and for some people, it's a big wake-up call because they can't show off how important they think they are. On my second ship, we had this new guy who was really rich growing up. He was a real jerk about it too, always telling us how much better he was than everyone else. He thought he was too good for regular work because he was going to be an officer someday, maybe even the boss of a whole ship. There's this joke in the military about guys who think they're too good to be regular sailors. This guy was exactly like that. He always tried to get out of doing the hard work that everyone else had to do. Well, a few hours into his first time out at sea, something funny happened. This guy got super seasick. And I mean really, really sick. It wasn't just for a little while. It lasted for days. Now, usually when someone gets that sick, you feel bad for them. It's pretty awful to watch someone who can't even open their eyes without throwing up. But with this guy, we didn't feel bad at all. In fact, it was kind of satisfying to see him taken down a peg. All his big talk about being better than everyone else didn't mean much when he was bent over the railing, green in the face. It just goes to show that the ocean doesn't care how rich you are or how important you think you are. Seasickness can hit anyone, and when it does, it doesn't matter if you grew up in a mansion or not. In that moment, everyone's the same, just trying not to puke. Story 21. There was this guy in our college dorm who thought he could do whatever he wanted because his dad used to play in the NFL and still had a lot of money. But this guy was doing some really bad things. He would get girls who were new to college super drunk until they passed out. Then he would do sexual things to them while they were unconscious and couldn't say yes or no. He even filmed it without them knowing. The next day, he'd show these videos to his friends. One of the guys he showed the videos to knew this was really wrong. He wasn't as close a friend as the bad guy thought. This person went to tell the dorm leader, who then told the campus police. The campus police called the real police because this was such a serious crime. One night, we saw a bunch of police cars show up outside our dorm. They came in and arrested the bad guy. They also took his phone and computer to find the videos he made, which they would use as proof of his crimes. It was actually kind of satisfying to watch him get arrested. Just because someone's family has money or fame doesn't mean they can hurt other people and get away with it. Story 22. I'll be honest, I was a bit spoiled growing up. We had a maid who came to our house several times a week to clean. I didn't think I was a brat, but I definitely had an easier life than a lot of other kids. When I went to college, it was like entering a whole new world. I knew how to pick up after myself, but I'd never had to clean a bathroom before. That was totally new to me. But the biggest shock, doing laundry, I had absolutely no clue what I was doing. I knew I was supposed to use detergent and something called softener, but I didn't really know what those were. I thought any kind of soap would work for clothes. One day, I was in the laundry room, completely lost. A campus security guard walked in, and I asked him how much dish soap I should use for my clothes. The guy just burst out laughing. I must have looked pretty confused, because after he stopped laughing, he actually helped me out. He showed me where to get the right kind of soap and explained how to use the washing machine and dryer. It was pretty embarrassing at the time, but looking back, it's kind of funny. I learned a valuable lesson that day. Just because you grow up with people doing things for you doesn't mean you'll always have that. It's important to learn how to take care of yourself. This experience taught me not to take things for granted. It also showed me that it's okay to ask for help when you don't know how to do something. Everyone has to learn sometime, and there's no shame in that. The important thing is being willing to learn and not expecting others to always do things for you. Story 23. I grew up around a lot of rich kids, and I still talk to some of them. There's this one guy whose dad owned the biggest, fanciest law firm in our town. This guy told me about a moment that completely changed his life. He used to get into trouble a lot, thinking his dad's money and connections would always get him out of it. One day, he got arrested for the second time. He thought it was no big deal. He'd just call his dad, and everything would be fine, like always. But this time was different. When he called his dad from jail, expecting a quick bailout, his dad just said, "Well, sorry to hear you got arrested. Good luck." Then his dad hung up the phone. Can you imagine how shocked he must have been? His safety net was gone. No more easy way out. He told me that when the police put him back in his cell after that call, it hit him like a ton of bricks. That was the exact moment he realized he needed to change his life. His dad wasn't going to keep rescuing him from his bad choices. This story shows how sometimes tough love can be the best thing for a person. The guy's dad could have kept bailing him out, but instead, he let his son face the consequences of his actions. It was probably hard for the dad to do, but it worked. His son finally understood that he had to take responsibility for himself. Story 24. I used to fix trails for the Forest Service, and let me tell you, it was a real eye-opener. Most of us aren't used to doing hard work outside all day and sleeping on the ground. We're all pretty spoiled that way. On the first day, a small plane would fly us to a grassy airstrip way out in the wilderness, about 40 miles from town. Then we'd put on our backpacks, grab some tools, and start hiking up a canyon. It was usually raining. It's hard to really understand what you're getting into until you watch that plane disappear. Then it hits you. You're going to be doing tough work all day, every day. For the first month, you're working, cooking, and camping in the rain. No phone, no mail, no real shelter. If you forgot to pack something, too bad, you'll have to do without it until July when the road opens. At night, wolves and mountain lions would circle our camp. Sometimes bears would try to get our food. It was pretty intense. Everyone has a hard time that first month. You'd see the tough guy from the high school football team sitting with his head in his hands at lunch, totally beat. Guys who could lift super heavy weights at the gym would be so tired they'd just eat peanut butter for dinner because they couldn't even cook. But here's the funny thing. It wasn't really about how strong you were. The best workers were often skinny, peaceful guys who'd read philosophy books around the campfire at night. They just took everything as it came, because no matter what happened, more challenges kept coming. The Mormon kids who grew up on ranches were great too. Nothing seemed to get them down. Story 25. I had this roommate in college who was pretty spoiled. His parents paid for everything he wanted. They even gave him their credit card to use whenever he felt like it. We were planning a trip, and his parents were going to pay for it. But my roommate came up with a sneaky plan. He told his parents the trip cost $400 more than it really did. Why? So he could use that extra money to buy a fancy bong for smoking. This guy was always using his parents' money. He'd order food on their credit card almost every day. He'd also make $50 purchases here and there, just because he could. Well, his parents eventually found out that he lied about the trip's cost. Surprisingly, they still let him go on the trip and paid for it. But afterwards, they took away his credit card privileges. You should have seen how this guy acted after that. He behaved like his life was suddenly super hard just because he couldn't use his parents' money anymore. It was pretty ridiculous. But here's the interesting part. Over time, he actually started to change. He had to learn how to manage his own money and not rely on his parents for everything. At first, he hated it, but eventually he got used to it. Now he acts way less entitled than before. He doesn't expect everything to be handed to him anymore. It's like losing that credit card taught him an important lesson about being responsible. Story 26. When I was in military training, there was this one guy who was a real pain. His dad was a drill sergeant at another base, and this kid thought that made him special. He'd always say stuff like, "Do you know who my dad is?" As if that meant he could do whatever he wanted. This guy was mean to pretty much everyone. He'd act like a jerk all the time, pushing people around and being nasty. A bunch of us almost got into fights with him, either defending ourselves or sticking up for our friends. Somehow we made it to graduation without anyone punching him. On graduation day, his dad showed up. Now you'd think the kid would be on his best behavior, right? Nope. His dad heard about how awful he'd been acting. After the graduation ceremony, our drill sergeants told us to stand at ease in our formation. That's when something amazing happened. The kid's dad walked up to our group, called his son to the front, and made him do push-ups right there in front of everyone. But it gets better. The dad made him say, "I'm sorry," over and over while doing the push-ups. And get this, the kid was wearing his fancy dress uniform. Can you imagine how embarrassing that must have been? Story 27. My wife had a really tough time in college. She got kicked out of her dorm, dropped from her classes because she couldn't pay, and even had her car taken away. This was shocking because her dad was supposed to be super rich. He was the CEO of a big company and made over $1 million a year back in the late 1990s. But here's what happened. The company was being sold, and all the big bosses were going to make a lot of money from it. They did background checks on everyone and found out her dad had been lying about pretty much everything. He didn't have the college degree he said he had. He never played pro football or been a war hero like he claimed. So they fired him and split his share of the money among themselves. The crazy part is, he didn't tell his wife or daughter about any of this. He just kept spending money like nothing had changed, even though he didn't have a job anymore. He even forged his wife's name on loans and credit cards to keep up their expensive lifestyle. Then one day he just left. He ran off with another rich woman he'd been seeing in secret. He declared bankruptcy, which is a way to say you can't pay your debts. Somehow, he managed to leave most of the money problems for my wife's mom to deal with. My wife had no idea any of this was happening. Her dad told her he was still paying for everything. When she found out the truth, her whole world fell apart. Her dad disappeared from her life for years. But my wife is tough. She picked herself up and started over at a community college. That's where I met her. I grew up without much money, so I taught her how to live a good life without spending a lot. It was a big change for her, but she learned fast. Now, almost 20 years later, we're doing well. We both have good jobs and our own family. My wife learned a lot from that hard experience. She even started talking to her dad again, though we're careful not to get too close because he still tends to lie a lot. Story 28. In my high school, there was this guy who was a real jerk to everyone. He only cared about himself, but people still sucked up to him because he was good at everything. He was the smartest kid in school and the star player in football, basketball, tennis, and track. He was also the leader in all the after-school clubs. This guy was really mean to my best friend. He made her cry a bunch of times just by being a jerk. He dated a lot of girls too, but only if he thought they were pretty enough and would do what he wanted. His family had some money, not crazy rich, but enough that he always wore expensive clothes from fancy stores. He'd brag about it and make fun of kids who couldn't afford nice stuff. He honestly thought nothing bad could ever happen to him because he was so special. After high school, he went to the college he wanted. As soon as he got there, he told everyone on social media that he was gay. He got his first boyfriend pretty quick, but then things started to go wrong. Before the first semester was even over, his boyfriend cheated on him. He also failed all his classes and had to leave that school. He ended up having to go to a different college. The last time I saw him, he was totally different. He was super polite and seemed like he'd learned a lot from his tough experiences outside our small town. It was like the real world had taught him that he wasn't as special as he thought. Story 29. When I was a teenager, something crazy happened. My sister and I saw two guys trying to break into her car. We ran downstairs as fast as we could to catch them. One guy managed to run away, but the other one just froze. He looked about my age. My sister called the police, and this kid kept looking around, probably trying to figure out how to escape. My sister told him, "Go ahead and run if you want. My brother will catch you." When the police came, the kid's parents showed up too. His mom drove a really fancy car and she was dressed in nice clothes. She looked like she had a good job. But boy, was she mad and upset. As soon as she got out of her car, she started yelling at her son. She said, "Why? We give you everything. You have everything you could want. Why would you try to steal? Don't we give you enough?" The kid looked like he wanted to disappear. He seemed to get smaller and smaller as his mom yelled. I just couldn't understand it. This kid had everything, a nice car, probably a nice house, parents who could buy him stuff. So why was he trying to steal my sister's car? It made no sense to me. What a jerk. But looking back, I hope that kid learned his lesson. Maybe he was hanging out with the wrong people who pushed him to do bad things. I hope he turned his life around and started making better choices. Story 30. I was at a farm party with my family when I was 16. It was a relaxed atmosphere, our parents chatting and cooking while us kids played around. Being the oldest kid there, I was trying to act all cool and aloof. But there was this German couple with a real terror of a 5-year-old kid. He was bullying all the other children, and his parents just sat there smiling, doing nothing about it. My parents told me to ignore him and keep my cool. I did because I didn't want to cause trouble. But then the kid found one of those plastic toddler walker toys and started ramming into other kids with it. I told him nicely to stop, but he ignored me and even started hitting my ankles. His parents just laughed. I'd had enough. So I came up with a plan. I stood in front of a small ditch in the grass, pretending to look at my phone. I was making myself an easy target. Sure enough, the kid came charging at me from behind. When he hit the ditch, the toy stopped suddenly. The kid flew over the handlebars past me and landed face first in the dirt. He wasn't bleeding, but he screamed like crazy. The best part? His parents saw the whole thing, but they had no idea I'd planned it. They were annoyed that their kid got hurt while I was supposed to be watching, but they couldn't really say anything. They just kept the boy close to them for the rest of the day. I know it wasn't the nicest thing to do, but it felt pretty good to see that little bully get a taste of his own medicine. And maybe it taught him that being mean to others can backfire on you. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways. Story 31. Back in high school, there was this guy who thought he was pretty special. He used to brag that he didn't need to pay attention in class or work hard. Why? Because of his grandfather's job, if you can believe it. His grandfather was a big shot at a company that made cardboard for cereal boxes. Not even the cereal company itself, just the company that made the boxes. This guy thought that somehow meant he had it made for life. He'd say things like, "I don't need to study. My family's connected to General Mills. I'm set for life." As if making cereal boxes was going to guarantee him an easy future. Well, guess what happened? Life doesn't work that way. 5 years after we graduated high school, I looked him up on Facebook. Turns out, he was still working the same job at Best Buy that he had back in high school. No fancy cereal box career for him. I don't know what happened to him after that, because he deleted his Facebook. But it just goes to show that thinking you're special because of what your family does isn't a good plan. It doesn't matter who your grandpa is or what company he worked for. You still need to work hard and learn if you want to succeed in life. Story 32. When I was about 14 or 15, I saw something really crazy at our local drugstore. This store was in a fancy neighborhood and often attracted some pretty snobby people. One day, I was there and saw this grown woman, maybe in her 30s, sitting on the floor in the makeup aisle. The store manager came storming over, looking really mad. The manager said to her, "Ma'am, you know you have to pay for those, right?" The woman looked confused and asked, "What?" He pointed at all these open makeup packages around her and said she had to pay for them all. I looked closer and saw piles of opened pressed powder compacts everywhere. This lady had opened one of every single shade from every single brand. There must have been at least 40 open packages. The woman got upset and said, "Why do I have to pay? I only need one." The manager, looking like he might explode, explained that she'd ruined all of them and no one else could buy them now because she'd used them. She yelled back, "Well, I needed to test them to match my skin tone." I noticed she'd even used the makeup sponges that come with the compacts and had a pile of used baby wipes next to her. The manager told her she now owed the store a lot of money. She started crying and refused to pay. He threatened to call the police. I had to leave then, so I didn't see how it ended. But I did some math later. Each compact probably cost about $5 or $6 back then, so she probably had to pay at least $240 for all the makeup she opened. Story 33. This reminds me of a friend I had who came from a rich family. He was a really interesting case because he broke all the rules of what you'd expect from a successful student. This guy partied every single night. I mean, every night. He was always out late, having fun, and probably drinking too much. You'd think someone like that would struggle in school, right? Wrong. He was studying aerospace engineering, which is super hard. It's all about designing airplanes and rockets. Most people have to study all the time just to pass. But not this guy. He got straight A's without even trying. I remember having a class with him. We'd sit next to each other during tests. He'd show up looking like he hadn't slept, probably with a headache from partying the night before. But he'd still ace the test, maybe missing one question at most. Meanwhile, I'd study really hard for days before the test. I'd work my butt off trying to understand everything. And what would I get? A C. To this day, I have no idea how he did it. School just seemed easy for him. He's now a really successful engineer, still doing great in his career. It's one of those things that doesn't seem fair. How could someone party so much, never study, and still do so well? But I guess some people are just naturally good at certain things. Or maybe he had a secret study method he never told anyone about. Story 34. My friend has a younger brother who's really spoiled. This kid acts like everything should go his way all the time. His dad tries to be strict with him, but his mom lets him get away with almost anything. So he never really learns his lesson when he does something wrong. This kid gets mad super easily, even over little things. One day I was hanging out at my friend's house. We were downstairs when we heard a loud crash coming from the brother's room upstairs. We found out later that he was playing Fortnite on his TV. He got so angry at the game that he threw his controller at his glass table. The table shattered into pieces. My friend called me on Discord later that day to tell me what happened after their dad got home. Their dad was not happy at all. He grounded the brother for a whole month. That meant no video games and no going to friends' houses. But that wasn't all. The dad made the brother pay for a new table out of his own allowance money. He also had to do extra chores around the house as punishment. It might seem harsh, but honestly, the kid kind of deserved it. He can't just break stuff when he gets mad, especially expensive things like a glass table. This was a good lesson for him about controlling his temper and taking responsibility for his actions. Story 35. There was this kid I knew in high school who came from a really rich family. When he went off to college, he thought it was going to be one big party. And for a while, that's exactly what it was. He went out every single night having fun instead of studying. But here's the thing about college. You can't just party all the time. You actually have to do your schoolwork and pass your classes. This guy wasn't doing any of that. He was failing pretty much every class he was taking. His parents found out about his bad grades. Now, you might think they'd just yell at him or something, but they came up with a clever plan instead. One Saturday morning, super early when their son was probably still asleep after another night of partying, they drove up to his college. They had a spare set of keys to the fancy car they had bought for him. Without telling him they were coming, they used those spare keys to get into his car. Then they just drove off with it. Can you imagine waking up and finding out your car is gone? And then realizing your own parents took it? This was probably a big wake-up call for that guy. His parents were showing him that if he couldn't handle the responsibility of college, he couldn't have the perks that came with it. Like a nice car. Story 36. I went on a double date with my boyfriend, his friend, and his friend's date. The girl my boyfriend's friend brought was not very nice at all. She acted like she was better than everyone else and demanded whatever she wanted. At the restaurant, she was really mean to the servers. She ate all her food, then tried to get it for free by complaining about it. When that didn't work, she said we shouldn't leave any tip at all. She complained about everything the whole time we were there. After dinner, we all got in her car to go home. She started driving, but halfway through the trip, she suddenly said she didn't want to drive anymore. The rest of us had been drinking, so we couldn't take over. It wouldn't have been safe. Instead of being responsible, she did something really dangerous. She said, "Fine, but I'm not driving either." And then she let go of the steering wheel and slammed on the brakes. We got hit by the car behind us. Luckily, it was her car, so the rest of us didn't have to pay for the damage. But she sure did. It was like karma happened right away for how badly she had been acting all night. Story 37. There was this kid I knew in high school whose family was super rich. When he got his driver's license, his parents bought him a really expensive car, a Mercedes that cost $70,000. That's more than some people make in a whole year. But this kid didn't appreciate how lucky he was. Within just a month or two, he crashed the car. And it wasn't just a little accident. He totally wrecked it. The worst part? He was driving drunk when it happened. Now, usually when someone drives drunk, they get in big trouble. It's called a DUI, and it can mess up your life. But his parents used their connections to help him avoid the worst consequences. They basically used their money and influence to get him out of trouble. And then, if you can believe it, they bought him another $70,000 Mercedes. It's like they didn't think he needed to learn any lessons from what happened. Sadly, this story doesn't have a happy ending. When the kid was 23 years old, he took way too many drugs and drank too much alcohol. He overdosed and died. Story 38. In high school, there was this really mean rich kid. Let's call him Todd. He loved to bully other kids and always bragged about how important his dad was. I couldn't stand him. One day in our last year of high school, I was having a really bad day. Todd saw me in the hallway and made fun of my shirt. I told him to leave me alone because I wasn't in the mood for his nonsense. But Todd didn't stop. He came over to my locker, slammed it shut, and shoved me. I don't remember what he said next, but I just got so angry that I punched him hard in the nose. The next day, I got called to the principal's office. Todd was there with his dad, and I thought I was in big trouble. The principal showed us the security camera video of what happened. I was sure I was going to get kicked out of school. But then something surprising happened. Todd's dad put his hand on my shoulder and smiled. He told Todd to thank me. Todd was confused and said, "Why would I thank him? He broke my nose." His dad's answer shocked us both. He said, "Because if I had been there and seen you act like that, I'd have killed you." Then Todd's dad just stood up and left. The principal told me I could go back to class. After that, Todd never bothered me again. Story 38. I used to work as a counselor at a fancy summer camp. A lot of the kids who went there came from really rich families. We're talking families who could afford to own a second house just for vacations, worth about $2 to $3 million. Most of these rich kids were actually pretty nice, but there was this one kid who stood out. His dad used to play in the NBA, that's professional basketball, and this kid thought that made him special. At camp, we had this fun game called Blob Wars. A blob is like a giant air mattress in the water. You jump on one end and it launches someone off the other end. In Blob Wars, you try to knock other people into the water. This kid tried to use his fame to win at Blob Wars. He'd make deals with other kids so they'd get knocked off before him. I watched this for a while, then decided to join in. When the kid asked me to team up with him, I said no. He tried to argue, saying his dad paid a lot of money to send him to camp. I told him that getting thrown off the blob was part of what makes camp fun for everyone. You know what? After a couple of days, the kid actually started to relax and have fun like everyone else. He stopped trying to use his dad's fame to get special treatment. Story 39. My old roommate had a sister who was really spoiled. She didn't know how to do anything for herself. Not laundry, not cooking, not cleaning. Nothing. Her mom paid her rent, and she didn't even have to work while she was in college. She had it made, but she was pretty clueless about real life. On her first day in the big city, she got her Social Security card stolen because she kept it in her wallet. We warned her not to do that, but she thought she knew better. Living with us, we had some basic rules, like you can't let your friends live in our apartment. It's against the rules of our lease. And if her friends came over and made a mess or ate all our food, she needed to pay us back. We didn't make much money, so we couldn't afford to feed everyone. We also asked her to be quiet at night and clean up after herself. She didn't like these rules, so she got her dad to move her out. She went to live with two people who had some serious problems. One who had a mental illness and wouldn't take their medicine, and another who kept way too much stuff. Her parents warned her that if she moved out, they wouldn't give her money anymore. She did it anyway. Then she started complaining about how hard life was. She had to get a job at a fast food place. Someone stole her paycheck because she kept all her cash in her wallet. She couldn't afford internet or food. In the end, she quit school and moved back in with her mom. Story 40. There was this really rich girl at my school who thought she was better than everyone else. One weekend, while her parents were away, she threw a huge party at her house. She invited all the popular kids, but not me. The party got way out of control. People were drinking, making out, and breaking things. Someone even tried to cook noodles in the hot tub and broke it. The next day, the girl posted pictures of the mess online, joking that the maids would have to clean it up. She was being really mean about it. On Monday, the girl came to school acting weird. She was really quiet and went straight home after class. Later, my mom, who's a doctor, told me what happened. It turns out one of the cleaning ladies who worked at the rich girl's house was my mom's patient. She told my mom the whole story. When the cleaning lady came to work on Sunday, she saw the huge mess. The rich girl, still hungover, told her to clean it all up. When the cleaning lady said no, the girl threatened to get her fired. But the cleaning lady was smart. She took lots of pictures of the mess and sent them to the girl's parents. 10 minutes later, the girl's phone rang. It was her parents, and they were furious. They told the girl she had to clean everything herself. They took away her money, phone, and computer for the rest of high school. That's a year and a half. They also said sorry to the cleaning lady for their daughter's behavior. The rich girl started crying and begged the cleaning lady to help her clean. But the cleaning lady said no and left her to do it all by herself. Later that evening, the parents came to the cleaning lady's home. They apologized again, called their daughter a spoiled brat, and even gave the cleaning lady a raise. Oh, and that broken hot tub. It couldn't be used for 4 whole months. Story 41. I once had a woman in her late 20s try to rent a house from me. Right away, I got a bad feeling about her. She was really demanding. She wanted me to change light bulbs, argued about the basement, and insisted on a new fridge because she thought it was gross that someone else had used it before. She kept saying things like, "It shouldn't be a problem to rent to me. My daddy makes a lot of money." This made me suspicious, so I looked into her background. What I found was pretty shocking. She'd been kicked out of her last 3 houses for not paying rent. Her credit score was terrible, the worst I'd ever seen. And instead of sending her own pay stubs to prove she could afford the rent, she sent her father's. I called her previous landlord and found out her pattern. She would move in, wreck the house, get evicted, and then her dad would pay for all the damage and the rest of the rent. Then she'd just move on and do it all over again. When I called to tell her she couldn't rent my house, she was totally surprised. She couldn't believe it. When she again mentioned her dad's money, I told her, "I wouldn't even let you borrow my pen, even if it was chained down." That's how little I trusted her. The sad thing is, with a record like that, she'll probably have a really hard time ever renting a place again. Story 42. When I was in my first year of college, I had a roommate from the Middle East. His family was super rich because of the oil business. This guy was used to having everything done for him at home, so college life was a big shock. One morning, I woke up and went to our little kitchen. I found my roommate there, trying to eat breakfast he'd made himself. He looked pretty confused. He asked me, "How do you usually make fried eggs?" "Mine taste really crunchy." I looked at his plate and couldn't believe what I saw. He had cracked the whole egg into the pan, shell and all. He'd cooked and tried to eat the egg with the shell still on it. I couldn't help but laugh. It was just so funny to see someone who'd probably never cooked anything in his life try to figure out how to fry an egg. But at the same time, I felt kind of bad for him. It must have been really hard to suddenly have to do everything for yourself when you're not used to it. Story 43. My dad owns a bar, and one night something pretty interesting happened there. This rich kid came in with his friends. You could tell he was rich by the way he dressed. He even had those fancy boat shoes on without socks. This kid started picking on one of the bartenders because the bartender was kind of short. He kept bothering him for about half an hour, just being really mean about the bartender's height. Finally, the bartender had enough and got my dad to come out. Now, my dad doesn't put up with people being bullies in his bar. He started yelling at the rich kid, but not just because he was being mean. He told the kid something important about the bartender. It turns out the bartender was a veteran. He had joined the military and fought in Afghanistan. My dad told the rich kid how ashamed he should be for making fun of someone who had risked his life for our country just because of how tall he was. The rich kid wasn't so tough after that. He actually left the bar almost crying. Story 44. I live in an area with a really rich school system. Most of the kids have parents with lots of money, and they can be pretty cocky about it. My family isn't rich like that, which makes us kind of different. Our school has 2 baseball teams. Team A plays in a higher league, and Team B, my team, plays in a lower league. Me and my friends have played on Team B for years. This year, Team A was full of the richest kids in school. They had super expensive $700 equipment and were always bragging about how good they were. But here's the funny thing. Our Team B won our league, while Team A came in last in theirs. I think to try and feel better about themselves, Team A set up a practice game against us. Before the game, they kept making fun of us. They said our normal metal bats were nothing compared to their fancy wooden ones with their names carved in them. Our coach told us not to hold back, so we didn't. After just 4 innings, less than half a game, we were winning 13-0. Their team had only gotten 2 players on base the whole time. My brother was pitching amazingly, and I was catching for him. Our whole team was hitting great too. It got so bad that their coach made them quit the game early. We felt pretty good about winning like that after all their trash talk. Story 45. I once went grocery shopping with a friend who had never really thought about money before. She was used to her dad just giving her his credit card so she could buy whatever she wanted. She never checked prices or paid attention to how much things cost. But this time was different. It was the first time she had to use her own money to buy groceries. Let me tell you, it was a big wake-up call for her. As we walked through the store, I could see her getting more and more stressed out. She kept looking at prices and putting things back on the shelves. When we got to the checkout, I thought she might freak out when she heard how much everything cost. Now, I've grown up without a lot of money, so I'm used to being careful about what I buy. I have to admit, it felt kind of good to see my friend finally realize that things in life aren't free. It's not that I wanted her to feel bad, but it was nice to see her understand what most people deal with every day. Story 46. There was this kid in my high school whose family was famous for being in politics. He didn't try hard in school and was pretty mean to people. After we graduated, he didn't do much for a while. Then he decided to run for political office, using the same name as his dad. People voted for him thinking it was his dad, not knowing it was actually the kid. Once he became a state representative, he did some really inappropriate things. He made bad jokes on Facebook about hurting women and tried to join a group for black politicians just because he liked hip-hop music. He even dropped a loaded gun on the floor during a meeting, right after arguing that he should be allowed to carry a gun because he was responsible. Despite all these problems, he kept getting reelected. This was because his family knew a lot of important people, and some political groups really liked him. After 6 years, things got even worse. He got caught trying to have sex with a kid he met online. When the police arrested him for that, they also found out he was selling drugs. The saddest part is that his family is actually really nice and did good things for the community. Now they have to deal with all the trouble he caused.